We gathered a couple 100,000 and more signatures. That brought it directly to the Washington State Legislature. They chose not to act on it, but under the provisions of our process, it was then automatically referred to the people for a vote. So the legislature didn't act, but the people will in November.
What about at a much higher level, a presidential level, a national leader level, because this does come up at international conferences?
I like to look at what happened in alcohol prohibition in the United States. We had a constitutional amendment to make alcohol illegal. We then had a repeal through another constitutional amendment in our history after we learned that alcohol prohibition was funding mafia and violent gangs. If that sounds familiar, it should. I think what we saw in alcohol prohibition historically in the United States was that it took states to begin to rebel against the failed criminal prohibition of alcohol. And that's exactly what happened. States began to pass their own laws. I believe that's what will happen in the United States now, that it will take states to be courageous and step forward, like Washington State, like Colorado. I think California, Oregon, and others will follow, and without doubt we will attract the attention of the Congress and the federal government. Some of that might not be so good.
How far along are the states on that road then?
Well, you know, if the Washington vote will take place in a matter of months, if it passes, the state law of Washington State will have changed, and it will be legal, as I've indicated, in small amounts for adults across the board in the state. The federal government can still enforce its criminal laws, and so there will be, I think, a forced dialogue between the state and the federal government. I think it may well end up in a lawsuit. The federal government may choose to bring a lawsuit. My hope is that the federal government will begin a serious reevaluation of its failed policy.
In the Canadian context, there one ban or not to ban is essentially a federal matter. But what do you want the province to do anyways?
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that the status quo always has a huge amount of inertia attached to it, even when the status quo is a failed public policy. And so you've got to mobilize to create the inertia, to create the momentum for change. I think you can do that in a hotel ballroom in downtown Vancouver. You can do it by getting provincial governments gradually, but I hope inevitably, to align in support of this change. The change does require federal legislative change, in my view. But the campaign, if you will, the momentum can start in the neighborhoods of any city, and over time, I think the momentum that is gathering from this campaign will, in fact, persuade federal policymakers that they are out of step with the community consensus of Canadians, and that it's time for federal change.
How's Victoria's feedback so far? I think you have touched base with the folks in Victoria. What are the feedback so far?
Well, even the provincial government has made the point publicly, and perhaps not surprisingly, that this is a matter of federal law, and so they deferred, if you will, to the federal government for the policy leadership here. That's their public view. I have private conversations with members of the legislature on both sides of the House who express interest, who want to learn more, and also privately will express support. So we're not at the point yet where our provincial government is willing or able to take the public leadership position, but we may get there. And I think that events like this and days like today are about building that momentum.
Yeah, I would just add, I've had a lot of private conversations with elected officials in BC, and what people will say behind closed doors. And what's been particularly exciting is it's really been the sort of right of center fiscal conservatives who have really been the strongest supporters and cheerleaders behind the scenes. So I think it's just a matter of time, and we can't accept sort of deference to the federal government on this. The gang violence, the organized crime activity that's happening in this province requires leadership at a provincial level, especially if we're getting silence from the feds in terms of doing something that will actually address these concerns.
Can we address the elephant in the room here? Marijuana is a major part of an even larger problem. There
Can I try that from a Canadian's perspective and then pass that on? Because in British Columbia we deal with these issues, and from a public health perspective, you know, the war on drugs hasn't worked with any of these drugs, and it's contributed to health-related harms. But in terms of the organized crime issues in BC, we're a cannabis-producing region. We don't grow poppies. We don't grow coca leaves. We don't have a huge export market for those. And the domestic markets are tiny in comparison to marijuana. So we have a huge marijuana problem here, and I think a simple solution to it that would lead us moving from a violent, unregulated market that benefits organized crime to a strictly regulated market with public health and safety as its goals, that would wage economic war on organized crime and move money towards governments instead of gangsters. So I think lumping all these drugs together has been a huge mistake, and that we need to look at each one of these drugs individually in terms of the law enforcement and public health approaches that could be best applied to them to best protect public health and safety. So you can't say change it for them all, but certainly for marijuana, I think the path forward from a public health and safety perspective is clear.
There's still a common denominator, though, in terms of harm. Wouldn't maybe not legalizing it, not taxing it, regulating it, but is there a similar solution for these other products that are in the market?
Yeah, I want to give John and Geoff, if he wants to comment on this as well, a chance to speak. But just to give you a perspective, we already have a heroin prescription study happening in the downtown east side of Vancouver that looks absolutely nothing like what a taxed and regulated market for marijuana would look like. Heroin is extremely dangerous. Organized crime benefits from its distribution. And Canada and a number of other countries are studying what an incredibly strict prescription model for intractable opiate addicts might look like. So again, I don't think they should be lumped together, but the issues with organized crime benefiting from the illegality of these drugs, I think everyone would agree there's certainly parallels.
I might just offer on the U.S. I agree with most of what Evan just said. I think in the United States, the schedule of drug enforcement is broken up into Schedules 1, 2, and 3. Schedule 1 says this applies to heroin, marijuana. Marijuana is listed after marijuana in Schedule 1, our highest level of enforcement in the United States. I think if there's not a bright line, I think there's a pretty clear distinction between the pharmacological and physiological impacts of heroin, a narcotic, versus marijuana, which is not a narcotic. And I do think that we can draw that line. I think that if you were to look at the harmful effects of the proceeds that I've discussed, they can be categorized with marijuana. So I think public health is always a worthy discussion around any drug that's been criminalized. But I want to be clear that our proposal in Washington State relates only to marijuana. I do think that there is a bright line. I wouldn't rule out that discussion, but it's not my discussion.
Go ahead.
My question is, why now, as Ms. McKay and Mr. Simon was former attorney both in Washington State and BC, why now there was this issue not
In my case, there's several answers to that question. So it doesn't feel like it's been that long, but it's been almost a decade since I was the Attorney General of British Columbia. And what I would say in that decade is that things are worse. And we should learn from experience and be prepared to change our perspective as we learn. I think that the spread and the proliferation of dangerous gang activity associated with the cross-border marijuana trade is a problem that is getting worse. It was a problem 10 years ago. When you're in government, you have to make choices as a government, as a collective, about the policies that you collectively advocate. That's our system here in Canada. And the marijuana issue was not a priority for the government of British Columbia in the term when I was the Attorney General. So it was not really, there was not the opportunity to advance it. That's the way it was then. I think that the landscape has changed. Frankly, in terms of why I'm doing this now, It's because I'm actually honored to have been asked to contribute to this organization. It was the accident of an email or a phone call from Evan, who said, "Look, this movement is growing. It's gathering steam. Would you be interested in adding your voice?" And I said, "I'm flattered to be asked. If you think I could make a difference, then I'm happy to try to do so."
What about the argument some people may have that there's a lot of people right now that aren't smoking marijuana because it is illegal. If it's legalized, they'll start to smoke it, which could create a whole new set of problems.
Well, from my standpoint, I think this is clear from the experience in Europe that there is, in most regimes where there is a massive decriminalization or regulation of marijuana, a brief spike up in the use of marijuana, but that usually moves back down. What we find is that people are going to smoke marijuana whether it's legal or illegal, but most people would prefer to purchase their marijuana legally. So it's not a question of increased use, it's actually a question of where they're going to buy the marijuana and where the proceeds go to. I think a big concern is on youth consumption of marijuana. I don't have any doubt that every 14-year-old in Vancouver can find marijuana the same way every 14-year-old in Seattle can find marijuana. I would prefer to have that subject to a public health approach where families and kids are educated about the potential addictive qualities of marijuana, because they are. And they need to know about that, and I think discourage from its use, frankly, and let adults make their own decisions when they're properly informed. So I think that's the question. I would not expect a huge increase in marijuana based on experience in Europe.
Mr. McKay, you mentioned your opinion of Marc Emery, and you said that you had no regrets in prosecuting him because he broke the law. But since you now disagree with that law and think it's harmful, shouldn't Emery really be regarded as a hero, like others who have broken laws in the past to change things with civil disobedience, like slavery, segregation, and alcohol prohibition?
I'm not in a position to morally judge Marc Emery. I mean, I had a simple function. I'm not going to tell you I didn't think about it. I did. I think my first prosecution as a young prosecutor in the United States was a marijuana possession charge. Frankly, I didn't give that one a lot of thought other than how to get the job done. I do think it's really important that we distinguish between those required to enforce the laws, who actually swear an oath to enforce the laws, that they go about their business in a way that they should. So no, I actually don't think he's a hero. I think that he should have run for the parliament. I know he ran for mayor. I believe he ran for mayor. Good on him for that. But I don't think choosing to violate the law in that way. I mean, he made a decision which would have allowed any juvenile to obtain marijuana in the United States. I think that's wrong.
Right, but civil disobedience is a tactic, though.
I don't think that's civil disobedience myself, but that's my opinion. You're entitled to yours. I don't agree. I wish Marc would have chosen another path. I wish he could have joined us up here, as I understand Jodie will in a few moments. Thank you.
Sure.
In Amsterdam, where they are considering sort of reversing in part their soft drug policies, some of the people who are interested in closing off the coffee shops to tourists have said that, have drawn a link, that said that there are studies linking marijuana use and mental illness. Can you explain whether that link is causal or spurious?
Sure. And I think this reflects back on the comment about increased marijuana use under a taxation and regulation regime. So I think the key starting point, and this is where we really need policymakers to understand, is that marijuana is more freely and easily available to young people than alcohol and tobacco. I think many young people choose to use marijuana because of this forbidden fruit phenomena that these laws have created, and that what we've seen with the strict regulation of things like tobacco is that we can actually drive down rates of use. So in the case of a possible link between marijuana and mental illness, that's all the more reason to regulate this so that we can apply a public health approach and look to address those possible issues. No one is talking about allowing advertisement and promotion and normalization of this activity. What we're talking about is applying what we know has driven down rates of tobacco and applying that science, and it's a very vast science, to try and reduce rates of use, rather driving kids to the margins where these types of harms can occur, like the possible link with mental illness. Take a public health approach.
Have you seen evidence one way or the other to suggest whether one causes the other or it's the other way around? Do people use marijuana because they're mentally ill, or does marijuana use cause
Yeah, so I've reviewed this research because I'm the editor of the International Journal of Drug Policy, so I see these debates happening all the time. And the most striking thing is that if you look at rates of marijuana use internationally, you don't see a relationship to rates of things like schizophrenia. Can someone have acute intoxication on marijuana that looks like schizophrenia? I think they can. But you know, nobody from the Health Officers Council of British Columbia, of which I'm a member, is saying we should regulate marijuana because it's relatively safe in comparison to alcohol and tobacco. They're looking at heroin and these other things and saying the more dangerous, the more reason there is to regulate. So in the case of a possible link between marijuana and mental illness, that fits perfectly with that argument. Ian, I wonder if, okay. Happy to take any questions for Jodie.
How is this moment, Jodie?
How is this moment? I think it's always a great moment when we have more people joining the call to end prohibition in order to save lives, save money, and get rid of the criminal control of this industry.
How does it feel to sit beside the fellow that put your man away?
I know that he was just doing his job, as many people are asked to do their jobs. There are many harmless people who are put in prison, and I don't believe my husband should be in prison. I still miss him terribly. But I understand that this law, the prohibition of marijuana, forces police to continue to arrest people and put them in prison. And when we get people who were on the front lines, who saw the damage done, admit that the policy needs to be changed, I think that's always a wonderful thing.
Have you talked to Marc about what's going on here today? What did he say?
Absolutely. He is very pleased, as I am, the fact that Mr. John McKay here is supporting an initiative to tax and regulate marijuana in Washington State is a great step forward. And again, we're always happy to support anybody who supports ending prohibition.
Any word on Marc coming to Canada to serve out the rest of the states? How's that going?
He did apply last year for transfer to Canada, and he was rejected by the U.S. government for that transfer. He will be able to apply again in another year, and hopefully both governments will approve his transfer home. At this time, his early release date is July 2014, so we're almost halfway through. I'm just pleased that he will be coming home to me soon, while there are many other families whose loved ones won't be coming home soon. They face much longer sentences of 20, 30 years, even life, for drug crime offenses. So I'm happy to know that he's doing as well as possible given his situation. He brings a lot of positivity to others, and many other inmates in prison with him are pleased to know that there is a lot of reform going on outside of prison to try and save people's lives in terms of ending prohibition and changing our drug laws.
I see some media is starting to trickle out with trying to get things up. I'm happy to take a few more questions. Otherwise, I know Ian has the press release and some other materials to take with you. Yeah.
I just had a question for Professor McKay. You alluded to the connections between violence in Mexico and the here in this province. I think that's something that maybe some people don't think about it. And is there a way to quantify that or sort of establish that as a fact? We hear about that anecdotally. There's a connection between the grow-ops here and headless bodies in pits in Mexico. But how do we know that?
Yeah, I think any person who engages in this activity has to feel some responsibility. I feel responsibility as an American citizen for the fact that demand in the United States fuels production in British Columbia, which then is distributed in Southern California and along the southwest border through Mexican drug cartels. So gangs affiliated with dangerous drug cartels are distributing marijuana grown in British Columbia. It's being exchanged for guns and cocaine that come up here. So the negative impact of that is more than just the proceeds going to Mexican drug cartels at some level, but also what's coming back to Canada because of this production. And it is not a healthy bounty, if you will, from that production. So yeah, I think people need to see the direct connection, because I think it is a direct connection between production of some of the best pot in the world and its sale and distribution to satisfy a ravenous American market for marijuana, and the proceeds of which are not being taxed, the content of which is not being regulated. And in fact, these dollars are going to fund dangerous criminal gangs in Mexico, in the United States, and I think Dr. Wood pointed out pretty clearly here in Canada.
Last question for you. If marijuana is finally legalized, what happens to cross-border? Because in BC, there's a lot of people traveling to the States to shopping. If the customs starting to check every truck, every vehicle, what's going to happen to them? Like, is there anything you think about that when you raise this issue?
Well, you know, I think on both sides of the border, law enforcement, the border is an enforcement zone, and not a very good one, it turns out, because, you know, in the United States, the joke is that if you see a Canadian with a hockey bag, that's probable cause for an arrest, that inside the hockey bag is going to be a lot of marijuana. I'm sure the Canadian authorities feel the same way about cocaine and guns coming back across the border in exchange for marijuana. So I think actually the international border at this point is a pretty helpful enforcement zone with regard to the guns, the cocaine, the meth, the ecstasy, and other drugs going back and forth. I would like to see, as I said in my remarks, a coordinated policy, one in which these values are respected by both governments, which are independent, sovereign countries. They have to pass their own laws. But I hope that a recognition of the regional and international consequences, to include Mexico, are huge. And that requires coordinated policies where we mutually respect the roles of our legislatures and our Congress and our law enforcement officials, so that we are all promoting public safety. Law enforcement is about public safety. That does not rule out public health. I think it includes public health. Let's choose the best approach to keep people safe in both of our countries and in Mexico as well.
How much momentum has your organization gained since more people have come on board, especially guys in suits, in support?
It's hard to quantify momentum, I think. You know, we originally came forward with, you know, current police, former Supreme Court justices. You know, that was a big news day that day, and was followed up when the former mayors came on board. And then, of course, Geoff will remember when the former attorney generals came on board, and that was another big news day. What we really need to work on is the comments that are being made behind closed doors by politicians to translate into a rational discussion, recognizing, you know, the first issue, just the fact that marijuana is so freely and easily available, is reason that politicians should change the policy. The fact that it's costing tax dollars a huge amount of money and then also contributing to organized crime and gang violence is just totally unsustainable. But the momentum, I think, will come when currently sitting politicians begin to embrace this issue.
Yeah, I think that the work that Evan and the coalition are doing is obviously it's about advocacy, it's about momentum building, but it's also about education. And it's about educating the public about this failure. And as we get the opportunity to educate the public, we're educating voters who will tell their members of parliament what to do. So again, it's impossible to quantify that kind of momentum. But I think those conversations are starting to take place. The level of interest that I've experienced in this conversation from everyone that I talk to is really quite surprising. And gratifying and encouraging. So I choose to be an optimist. I think this is progress. I think we now have seen that the real future for this issue is cross-border conversations and education and policy reform. And I think that's also within our grasp if we just keep at it.
Will we ever see it in our lifetime?
I believe so.
Yes.
I have plans for a long life, of course. But then I also have plans for the Canucks in 7 games. So, but no, I actually let me just restate this. I was genuinely surprised at the extent of the positive reaction of each step of this work that Dr. Wood and the coalition are doing. I think it is making a difference. Is it going to be within the term of office of the current Prime Minister of Canada? I don't think so. But I think there's a realistic chance it could be within the term of office of the next Prime Minister of Canada. And that's a target that I think has an aura of reality about it that I think we should commit to.
I think the Washington State ballot initiative could totally change the landscape too here, right? Your average Canadian talks about, the borders will get sealed if we ever did anything. Whereas, if Canada doesn't change its laws, we're going to be looking to the south at, a whole much safer regulated regime that will obviously become the envy of Canadians.
And playing policy catch-up.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of momentum gaining, and it's great, like I said, that we're having so many different types of allies come forward. But I should remind people that for the many decades prohibition has been in place, it has been a lot of grassroots activists who have been pushing this. And my husband, although he did violate the law by selling seeds, nobody was harmed in that exchange, and the money used was sent to activists and organizations throughout the United States to try and push towards this change. So now that we've reached this tipping point, we have to remember that there are many people who laid a lot of groundwork to get a lot of organizations and politicians on board in order to get to this point that we're seeing now. So I invite anybody to join this argument that prohibition is a failed policy, but to remember that even civil disobedience, when it's done peacefully and non-violently, is an important step in changing any unjust laws. We know from many different historical examples that civil disobedience has been essential in repealing unjust laws. And Marc, with the money that he sent to Americans and the seeds that he sent to Americans so they could grow their own instead of buying from gangs, that his efforts, although illegal in the United States, did have a lot of impact on laying the groundwork over the decade leading up to this point where we are today.
I see there's a couple of Stop the Violence Coalition members who have flown in from out of town. So Dr. Kennedy, I see maybe this will be the last question.
Okay, my question is for Professor McKay. I can see you there. I understand that there's quite a strong venture capital market in the USA just hungering to get a hold of the cannabis marketing, advertising, distribution, etc. How strong are the potential regulations that your state is bringing in towards the actual regulation? My concern is that free enterprise is not the place to go for the marketing of cannabis.
I think if you think of I-502, our proposed regulation and taxation law in the state of Washington, as treating marijuana like alcohol, you'll get a picture of what our regulatory structure would look like. So anyone who's engaged in growing marijuana legally would be licensed. Anyone responsible for transporting the marijuana to the marketplace would be regulated. Anyone selling it would be regulated, just as we regulate those who manufacture and sell alcohol in the United States, and I believe it's true in Canada. So it's highly regulated but legal. And I do think, as a law enforcement person, having individuals poised to come into the market, whether it's in venture capital, as you've indicated, or those who might otherwise be thinking about businesses that might enter a legal market, will help in enforcement. Because I do think that the vast number of individuals who consume marijuana, whether Canadian or American, would prefer to do that legally. Of course, this will be in part dependent on price points. Those are all things that will have to be determined. How much you regulate, and most importantly, how much you tax it. We can move legal enterprises into the space currently occupied by the drug cartels. They're not going to go easily, and I don't want anyone to think that I am of the view that the moment you pass a regulation taxation scheme, the criminals are going to go away, the violent gangs and criminals. It's going to take many years to drive them out, but I would much rather build that around a legal enterprise where we recognize who the good guys are versus the bad guys. And our law enforcement on both sides of the border will have to be prepared, even in a legal environment, to kick the bad guys out and take the money away from them. So it will take venture capitalists, it will take businesses, but it'll take people with payrolls, with real employees who pay taxes, who are citizens who aren't armed with guns and carrying cocaine and meth and ecstasy in the other pocket.
I think we should stop there. Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate you helping to tell this story.